Thank you. I want to welcome Dr. Husser and Dr. Fernandez for joining us. They're the directors of the Elon poll, which just came out with their newest results, their latest results before the midterm election across the country, but specifically in North Carolina. And the results found that Kay Hagan is leading Tom Tillis 45-41 in the polls. So my first question is, the trend nationally seems to be Democrats aren't doing so well, unpopular Democratic president. How has the Hagan campaign been successful in maintaining a lead, or has it been a failure of the Tillis campaign to take the lead?
I guess we would want to assume that we're right, but given that there's lots of different polls and sampling error, most of the polls have shown, except for maybe one or two, that Hagan has a lead. But that lead could be tiny to all the way. I think in September we saw one poll that had a 9-point lead. I think we just saw some, what was it, Nate Cohen, that talked about how sometimes midterm election polling undercounts Democrats. We're not exactly sure why that is. When I was in Nevada, Harry Reid was facing a very tight race. All the likely voter polls showed that Sharon Angle was going to defeat him. Some of the registered voter polls that sort of have a little bit more expectation of Democratic turnout actually were more accurate. So you never quite know how it's going to be nationally and statewide if someone has a better ground game.
So given that Hagan is in the lead, what policy, or if we're right, what policy is she speaking to that voters are responding to? Is there a specific policy, or what's the most important issue in this election for North Carolinians?
There are a bunch of important issues in elections. It's easy to say, here's this one thing that changes the course of elections, but elections are a lot like people. There are a lot of reasons to explain our behavior. When you take millions of us aggregated together in elections, a lot of factors are going on here. As you pointed out earlier, it's not a good time to be a Democrat overall. The president is not popular at all in the state. People don't like the ACA or Obamacare. So why is Hagan ahead? A lot of it has to come down to the North Carolina General Assembly. Speaker Tillis was leading that organization in many ways, and it passed a lot of legislation that frankly just ticked off a lot of voters. If Tillis had distanced himself from some of those policies early on, we probably would have seen the race change. However, he decided to remain Speaker for a number of very good reasons, and he's had great difficulty in distancing himself from the more controversial pieces of legislation that have done a number of things, and particularly they've alienated a group of women voters that he desperately needs at this point.
Yeah, it definitely seems that the gender gap was very striking in the latest Elon poll. 18,
and we saw 19, I think, in September. And we don't want to discount the fact that incumbents have somewhat of an advantage. Sure. Not as much of an advantage as the House of Representatives, but on average, I think if you look at a number of years, 85% re-election rate, you know, that's not that easy to sort of defeat an incumbent, even in a midterm election when things are going sort of the right way for Republicans.
Which I guess is sort of a general question. Congress is so unpopular, except there's such a high re-election rate, 85% or whatever. How does that keep happening? Everybody hates Congress except for their senator or their congressman?
It's known as Fenno's paradox. It's been observed for a long time that you could hate Congress, but you love your member of Congress. That's changing a little bit. So now we're seeing more people hate Congress, and they also don't like their local representative. Much of this is due to the fact that local members of Congress, particularly in the House of Representatives, are embedded in their districts. So we just had an event here at Elon with Howard Coble. Howard had spent decades
30 years,
building time with his constituents, helping people with problems. So yeah, they may not like all the things that he voted for, they may not like what Congress is doing as a whole, but they liked him because he helped them with their Social Security or he helped them with some Veterans Affairs thing. That's the same case with the U.S. Senator. They may not like the senator overall, they may not like how the senator operates in Washington, but they don't necessarily see that. They see the senator saying, I got funding for this bridge, or I did this thing for the troops, or I prevented our military base from being closed. So in a lot of ways, they get the good stuff. And as Ken points out, unless an incumbent has really messed up big time, they get some sort of boost just because people know who they are, and people normally think, well, they haven't done anything that bad, so let's keep giving them another chance. If you read some of the endorsements that newspapers have made, it's that same sentiment. Hagan's not that great, but let's give her another chance.
Sure. So focusing again on North Carolina specifically, it seems, I mean, in the last few election cycles, midterms and general elections, it's such a swing state, such a divided state, contested state, and that's even on policy issues. It seems to be almost 50-50, pretty much down the line. What makes North Carolina such a politically diverse state?
You want to take that?
I mean, a lot of different things. One, there was a recent article that came out that said migration. This is a changing state.
Sure.
You have one of the fastest growing Latino populations. You have migration from the Northeast. That migration back from the Northeast, older people moving to sort of warmer climate, although it doesn't feel too warm today.
No.
That's actually a more complicated phenomenon because some of them actually tend to be Republican, but some of them are liberals, the classic Northeastern liberals, and that changing dynamic is really keeping this a purple state.
Keeps it different than maybe some other southern states, South
Absolutely.
Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama.
The real story of North Carolina is that Boss Wash corridor.
Sure, sure.
It's easy to get here compared to other states from less appealing climates. That's why we see so many students coming to Elon in many ways. The weather's much better here. Would you rather spend a December in North Carolina or in New Hampshire?
Yeah. And then back to the race. The two issues, other than the election, that we hear about so much on the news are Ebola and ISIS. Seems like those are the big two. When you polled, are those having any effect on the race?
Well, in September, we found that basically the number one issue that people thought the U.S. was facing were related to foreign affairs and sort of national defense. That hadn't really occurred since 2006 when we were bogged down in Iraq. And so I think that is on people's minds. How that is going to affect someone's vote, maybe that slightly gives an edge to Republicans who are often seen a little bit more hawkish or a little bit stronger on the international side. But I think it's complicated.
The way it helps Republicans is a complicated story, as he points out. It's not that people are like, oh, well, I'm really worried about ISIS, and I think Tom Tillis is better on ISIS and Ebola than Hagan, so let me go vote for Tillis. Rather, it changes the optics of what is being discussed from policies that favor Democrats to policies that don't necessarily favor Democrats. So because we're talking about Ebola, we're not talking about inequality.
And national security issues tend to favor Republicans more.
Generally, they tend to favor Republicans, but that's not universally the case.
The New York Times, there was a columnist in the New York Times that called this a boring election nationally, because there's been no real huge policy issues or proposals. It's been Democrats saying my Republican opponent is an extremist, and Republicans saying my Democratic opponent once shook hands with President Obama. Is that a pretty fair analysis of what's been going on across the country?
It's hard to boil down the complexity of a race in a single thing like that. However, you have to keep in mind the context of this race. We are in an extremely polarized Congress where almost nothing can get done. Because we have a stagnating legislative process right now, it means that candidates aren't talking about bold, big legislative packages because candidates generally don't like to make campaign promises they can't deliver on. And if any candidate said, hey, we're going to do this big, major, sweeping legislative package, they would not be telling the truth because that's not going to happen.
And often candidates want to be ambiguous because they don't want to be pegged down as being for abortion, against abortion, because they know that stance could sort of alienate one large sector of the vote. So they try to be ambiguous. But these issues pop up and they can't completely dodge them. Gay marriage, abortion, Obamacare, these things are always being asked by constituents and reporters.
And this race is set to become either one of or the most expensive Senate races in history. Most of that money, a lot of that money coming from outside the state, outside groups. What effect has that outside money had on the race other than every other commercial is an attack ad?
They've made a lot more annoying commercials, for sure. When you think about these dollars, yes, having more money matters, seeing more ads can influence a race, but it's kind of like a house. If you've got a 2,000 square foot house, that's a pretty good sized house. Your enjoyment of that house or the effect of having a house on your quality of life doesn't necessarily go up too much after a certain threshold. We see declining returns. It's the same way with ads. More ads do tend to persuade more people, get more people involved, but at some point you reach this threshold where there's such a saturation of ads that each additional dollar in ad spending has very little effect.
It all becomes white noise, sort of, you start tuning it out. Another wild card, I think, that might affect this race, the Libertarian candidate, Sean Haw, who's polling at I think around 6 to 9%, depending on what poll you look at. Do you think he has any chance to poll that significantly on Election Day, and who is he pooling votes from?
We do something that's a little bit controversial in that we don't mention Sean Haw's name in our question in the survey. We ask, you're going to vote for the two major party candidates or someone else, and then we ask, who that someone else is. Basically, only 10 people in our survey mentioned
10 people total.
10 people total mentioned the Libertarian Party or Sean Ha or the pizza delivery guy. And part of that is that he's guaranteed to get a certain amount of vote. I guarantee he's going to get at least 2% of the vote just by being on the ballot.
Sure.
But generally, surveys generally capture people that are willing to say they're going to vote for a third-party candidate. Either they don't show up to the polls, or when they do, they're like, that's probably a throwaway vote because it has no chance of winning. I'm going to choose one of the two-party candidates. So surveys aren't great at capturing what the true percentage, but it's probably going to be well below 6%. It's probably going to be at least 2%. I think surveys are just horrible at getting at third-party votes.
So you don't think he'll really have any major wild card effect on the race?
If it's really close, right? If it comes down to 2 points, the survey that we did online experiment showed that he's taking away more votes from Hagen than Tillis.
Really? Is that younger voters who primarily?
Younger voters are social liberals.
Okay.
So we think of libertarians, and we can easily think of folks like Rand Paul, who clearly identify with conservatives.
Sure.
In most areas pull votes from conservatives. Hall's a little bit different. His policies that he's talking about.
More weed,
tend
less
to-
war. This is his big slogan.
That's the Koch brothers slogan, because the Koch brothers and some other outside groups decided, well, we see Sean Hall's potential to take votes from Hagen. Let's spend money advertising on behalf of Hall, trying to take Hagen votes away.
Speaking of the Koch brothers, a lot of pro-Kay Hagen ads, I'm not sure if they're her ads specifically, focus on the Koch brothers and how they're stealing North Carolina. Have you ever seen a race where the attack ads have been focused on donors that are, the millionaire donors?
There's always been sort of talk about some millionaire donor or billionaire donor buying a race. We could find liberal equivalents to the Koch brothers as well.
George Soros.
Right.
Yeah.
It's nothing new. The Koch brothers get, I think, probably a disproportionate amount of attention in terms of being the boogeyman out there.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen them on billboards, on television commercials, and more so than you see her attacking Tom Tillis sometimes. Right. So it's an interesting, and we talked about ads earlier, how they can sometimes kind of become white noise, and people say they hate attack ads, they hate seeing them. But do they actually, they pop up every election cycle, so do they work?
Sure they work, and there's a lot to say in support of negative ads. I like negative ads in many ways. If you go through and you count the number of facts, the number of key pieces of information to help voters learn in ads, negative ads on average tell you a whole lot more than positive ads. Because if I was going to say something negative about you, I'd need facts to back that up.
Sure.
But if I said, you're a really nice guy, nobody's going to question me on that. So negative ads tend to contain more facts, more verifiable sources of information, and they do tend to work. What doesn't work and what does alienate voters turns them off are personal incivility between candidates. So ad hominem attacks, personal levels of nastiness, not so much saying, oh, well, this candidate did this conflict of interest.
And we find that basically experiments show that people remember negative facts more than positive facts. So generally, if you're going to spend money on a TV ad, saying something negative about your opponent is going to have more bang for their buck.
So, let me ask you, what is your prediction for who will win this midterm election? Are you going to stick by the polling results, or?
I mean, I guess we have to look at empirical evidence, and if you aggregate all the polls, our poll, of course, is the best, but if you aggregate all the polls, basically it gives Hagen a lead, and so that's probably a good prediction. Since the lead isn't massive, I think 538 predicts a 68% chance of Hagen winning. It's not 100%, it's not even 90%, but you have to go with that data.
Sure. You can stand by that as well.
Yeah.
And do you think the North Carolina will remain in the spotlight for future election? You will continue to be such a pivotal state for the next presidential election and beyond?
Probably so. If the General Assembly and the state Republicans, suppose the Tillis loses and they reflect on the last couple of years, I think they can still make a lot of policy accomplishments that they'd like to make, but in a way that's not antagonistic towards so many voters. If you'd have asked me 9 months ago who I thought was going to win, I would have said Tom Tillis. And I think that there's still a lot of opportunities for Republicans to compete very effectively in the state. That said, the state still has immigration from the Northeast. It has a growing Latino population. That and other demographic trends like young people tending to vote for Democrats suggest to me that North Carolina is not going to go out of play as a swing state.
Sure.
So if you don't like those bombardment of ads in 2014, oh well, they're coming in 2016.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it, and thanks for all your wisdom that you shared. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.